إذا شعفه.
A shadow stretches across the scorched dunes of the Nile, where the earth itself seems to groan under the weight of an ancient, buried pressure. It starts with the heavy silence of a wounded bird and ends with the screams of a family shattered by the impossible. Deep within the dark corners of a forgotten cellar, a basalt sarcophagus shifts, the kinetic friction of the past grinding against the present. This isn't the tomb of legends you remember. This is a high-octane descent into a nightmare where blood ties become the ultimate biological vulnerability. When the sky turns black with a suffocating sandstorm, the hunt begins. A journalist loses his world in the eye of the gale, only to find it 8 years later, wrapped in parchment and primordial terror. The silence of an Albuquerque home is suddenly broken by a rhythmic, frantic tapping. Morse code from the abyss. Is it a daughter finally returning to the light, or a vessel for an ancient architecture of pain? Every frame vibrates with the pressure of a demon waiting to be unmade, a force that turns the domestic sanctuary into a tactical trap. We aren't just watching a story. We are witnessing a total collapse of the natural order, a propulsive force of horror that bridges the gap between Cairo's heat and the cold isolation of the high desert. The ritual is already in motion. The skin is the blueprint. The sacrifice is mandatory. The tension is a living thing, breathing in the shadows of the attic. This is a cinematic reconstruction of fear. This is Lee Cronin's The Mummy 2026. The initialization of the 2026 supernatural hardware begins with a specific branding metric. This project operates under the official designation Lee Cronin's The Mummy. The infrastructure for this system state was established in June 2024 when New Line Cinema locked a release coordinate for April 17, 2026. This was not a standard reboot of the existing Universal Pictures pipeline. Instead, the blueprint required a total reimagining of the property, focusing on the physics of demonic possession and the biological fallout of an ancient burial. The production companies responsible for the hardware include Atomic Monster, Blumhouse Productions, and Wicked Good. This collective represents a tactical merger of James Wan and Jason Blum, two engineers of modern horror logistics who sought to recalibrate the franchise away from the 1999 adventure model. The decision to embed the director's name directly into the title serves as a defensive metric. This choice was calibrated to prevent any cognitive confusion with the previous Brendan Fraser era or the failed 2017 Tom Cruise experiment. The production logic stated clearly that the Sommers films occupied a different tonal frequency. To protect the new brand, the official Blumhouse communication terminal repeatedly confirmed that Brendan Fraser was not part of this specific hardware. This tactical distancing ensured that the audience focus remained on the new architecture. The project is a co-production between the territories of Ireland and the United States, utilizing a $22 million budget to build its skeletal structure. This fiscal constraint forced the team to focus on practical friction and set design rather than over-relying on digital overlays. The distribution pipeline was handled by Warner Brothers Pictures. Their logistical reach ensured that the film premiered at the American Legion Post 43 in Los Angeles on April 9, 2026. This was followed by a wide theatrical release that included IMAX theaters, providing a larger optical field for the high-pressure sequences. The system state of the film is classified as a reimagining. It utilizes the core mythology of mummification, but strips away the archaeological adventure tropes. It replaces them with a forensic study of how an ancient entity infects a modern family unit. This change in the narrative blueprint shifts the movie from a fantasy category into a pure horror diagnostic. The focus is on the hardware of the basalt sarcophagus and the kinetic force it exerts on the characters. The script's development was a response to personal biological loss. Director Lee Cronin utilized his own experience with grief as the primary blueprint for the story. He wrote and directed the project after completing his work on the Evil Dead Rise pipeline. He chose this specific infrastructure over a sequel to his previous hit, opting to build something entirely new within the Mummy ecosystem. The internal logic of the film is influenced by the Kelvin scale of the Egyptian desert and the cold, pressurized environments of modern suburban homes. The transition from the thermal load of Aswan to the domestic geometry of New Mexico creates a sharp contrast in the film's thermal profile. This is not a story about treasure. It is an audit of survival against a parasitic force that uses human skin as its primary recording medium. The film's critical response metrics provided a mixed diagnostic. While the direction and specific biological scares were praised, the running time and pacing calibration received a lower rating. On the Rotten Tomatoes metric, the film registered a 47% approval rating based on 187 data points. The Metacritic score was calibrated at 47 out of 100, indicating a balanced but divided reception. Despite these mixed signals, the fiscal return was a success. The film grossed $89 million globally, nearly quadrupling its production cost. This result proves that the branding protocol and the shift to a more grounded, forensic style of horror was a viable market strategy for New Line Cinema and its partners. The directorial logic of Lee Cronin is defined by a focus on the anatomy of the monster. In this 2026 system, the mummy is no longer a high-ranking pharaoh encased in gold. The new blueprint identifies the mummy as an average person who has undergone a brutal, ritualistic mummification process. This is a significant shift in the IP architecture. Cronin wanted to explore the kinetic vector of a body that has been preserved not for honor, but for containment. His research process for the visual assets included a forensic audit of North African cultural references and the study of bog bodies located in Dublin. These biological references provided the foundation for the character of Katie and the entity known as Nazmaranian. The partnership between Cronin and producers James Wan and Jason Blum created a unique production environment. Wan initially approached Cronin with a simple request to build a version of the movie that was actually frightening. Cronin accepted the logic and demanded total control over the creative pipeline. He discarded the connection to any previous Universal Pictures lore. This independence allowed him to use his own lens, which he described as 1 part poltergeist and 1 part Seven. The influence of the show Breaking Bad is also visible in the color palette and the saturation of the desert sequences. This tactical choice of influences results in a film that feels more like a forensic crime thriller than a traditional monster movie. Cronin's personal connection to the project acted as the primary behavioral stimulus for the script. He completed the blueprint for the film on the same day he suffered the loss of his mother. This biological event forced him to process his grief through the medium of the script. One specific scene in the film, involving the retrieval of a deceased person's false teeth, was directly inspired by a real-world phone call he had to make. This level of personal forensic detail adds a layer of authenticity to the Cannon family's distress. The set was treated as tactical geometry, where characters have nowhere to hide from the encroaching entity. The direction focuses on the physical displacement caused by the demon, emphasizing the weight and friction of every movement. The casting of the Egyptian assets was a mandatory requirement for Cronin. He sought to maintain a high degree of cultural calibration by hiring authentic Egyptian actors for the Cairo and Aswan sequences. This ensured that the colloquial language used in the film was accurate to the region. The relationship between the characters played by May Calamawy and May Elgady was a priority for the director. By using real-world linguistics and authentic behavioral patterns, Cronin grounded the supernatural elements in a believable infrastructure. The use of Arabic throughout the first act acts as a logical barrier for the American characters, increasing their cognitive load and sense of isolation during the sandstorm sequence. Filming logistics for the project began in March 2025. The production units were deployed to Ireland and Spain, using these locations to simulate the various environments required by the blueprint. The principal photography concluded in June of that year. Throughout the process, Cronin maintained a focus on the kinetic friction of the stunts and the physical reality of the mummified remains. He rejected the use of a pharaoh in a golden sarcophagus, opting instead for a black basalt container that feels like a piece of industrial hardware. This change in the film's material science reflects the overall shift toward a more clinical, forensic horror experience. The result is a system state that feels heavy, ancient, and undeniably dangerous. The lead biological asset in this forensic reconstruction is Jack Reynor, who occupies the role of Charlie Cannon. Charlie is a journalist, a character defined by his need to investigate and document the world. This internal programming makes his inability to solve the kidnapping of his daughter a catastrophic failure for his identity. Reynor's performance is calibrated to show the weight of 8 years of unresolved trauma. He is the central node of the family unit, attempting to maintain the structural integrity of his marriage to Larissa while facing a supernatural threat he cannot quantify. His progression from a man of facts to a man of sacrifice is the primary arc of the narrative blueprint. Laia Costa provides the counterbalance as Larissa Cannon. Her character is defined by the biological reality of pregnancy and the maternal drive to protect her remaining children. The arrival of the recovered Katie creates a massive cognitive load for Larissa. She must navigate the boundary between her love for her daughter and the forensic evidence that something is fundamentally wrong with the girl. Costa's performance focuses on the internal friction caused by this conflict. She represents the domestic sanctuary that is being systematically dismantled by the presence of Nazmaranian. Her role is crucial in establishing the stakes of the biological fallout within the Albuquerque household. The most significant physical asset in the film is Natalie Grace, who plays the role of Katie Cannon. Grace must portray two distinct system states: the innocent child in the prologue and the catatonic, self-harming vessel in the second act. The physical requirements for this role involve significant time in the makeup pipeline to simulate the mummification inscriptions on her skin. Her performance is clinical and detached, reflecting the behavioral stimulus of an entity that has replaced her personality. The way she uses Morse code to communicate is a brilliant tactical choice, allowing her to interact with the environment without breaking her catatonic silence. Her presence is a constant source of friction for the other characters. May Calamawy enters the system as Detective Dalia Zaki. Dalia is the forensic investigator who bridges the gap between the American family and the Egyptian cult. She is the character responsible for the audit of the VHS tape and the translation of the ancient ritual logic. Calamawy's performance is defined by a high degree of competence and a calm, tactical approach to the supernatural events. She provides the necessary information to help Charlie understand the demonic transfer chant. Her character is a vital component of the narrative hardware, acting as the primary detective asset who discovers the buried pyramid in Aswan. Without her logical intervention, the family would have no blueprint for survival. The supporting cast includes several other key biological assets. Shiloh Molina and Billy Roy play the younger Cannon siblings, Sebastian and Maudie. These characters serve as the vulnerable nodes within the tactical geometry of the house. Their cognitive states are easily manipulated by the possessed Katie, leading to the destruction of their grandmother, Carmen, played by Veronica Falcon. Falcon's character represents the traditional Catholic faith, an older belief system that fails to account for the physical reality of the Nazmaranian demon. The cameo by Lily Sullivan as Miss Mills provides a brief link to Cronin's previous film infrastructure, adding a subtle nod for those familiar with his creative history. Together, this ensemble creates a realistic portrait of a family under a high-pressure siege. The fiscal performance of Lee Cronin's The Mummy is a critical metric for understanding its success in the 2026 market. With a production budget of $22 million, the film was designed to be a lean, high-yield product. Its opening weekend in the United States and Canada generated $13.5 million across 3,304 theaters. This placed it in the third position for the weekend, trailing behind high-budget assets like the Super Mario Galaxy movie and Project Hail Mary. However, its international performance provided a significant boost to its overall hardware. It earned an additional $20.9 million from 78 international markets during its launch phase. The total global gross of $89 million represents a successful calibration of the brand. For a film with a C+ cinema score, this level of financial return indicates that the Mummy name remains a powerful attractor, even when the content is shifted toward a more forensic and disturbing style. The digital streaming release followed shortly after, on May 19, 2026. This quick transition from the theatrical window to the home media pipeline allowed the studio to capitalize on the word-of-mouth momentum. The upcoming release on 4K Ultra HD and Blu-ray in July is expected to further solidify the film's fiscal blueprint, targeting collectors who value the film's specific optical distortion and technical specs. Critical metrics for the film provide a more complex diagnostic. The consensus among data points suggests that the gore and personal stakes were high-quality components, but the running time was poorly calibrated. Critics like Johnny Olksinski gave the film a low rating, suggesting that the movie was essentially a version of The Exorcist with different bandages. Other audits, such as those from the Globe and Mail, noted that the film was a mess of various horror influences like Hereditary and Evil Dead. These reviews indicate that, while the film's infrastructure was solid, its internal script logic and pacing didn't meet the expectations of all observers. The Metacritic score of 47 reflects this lack of a unified verdict from the critical community. Despite the mixed reviews, the film's technical execution remains a strong point in its audit. The use of IMAX theaters for certain sequences allowed for a deeper immersion into the film's tactical geometry. The marketing strategy, which repeatedly stated that Brendan Fraser would not appear, was a necessary tactical maneuver to manage audience expectations. This clarity helped the film find its own identity as a separate entity from the Sommers franchise. The presence of James Wan and Jason Blum as producers provided a safety net for the production, ensuring that the film had the necessary industry support to reach a wide audience. Their involvement is a key metric in the film's ability to secure such a large number of theatrical screens. The final fiscal verdict for the project is positive. It achieved its goal of reinventing a dormant IP for a new generation of horror enthusiasts. By focusing on a smaller budget and high-pressure practical effects, the team created a sustainable model for future installments. The biological fallout of the story leaves the door open for further audits of the Nazmaranian demon, providing a potential blueprint for a larger cinematic system. As the film moves into its long-term home media phase, it will likely continue to be analyzed for its unique contribution to the horror genre. The $89 million result is a clear indicator that there is still a significant market for the Mummy brand when it is presented through a fresh, forensic lens. The evolution of the Cannon family across the 8-year gap is the primary behavioral stimulus of the story. In the prologue, the family is a healthy, functioning unit living in Cairo. The kidnapping of Katie acts as a terminal error that shatters their internal programming, When the story resumes in Albuquerque, we see a family that has moved into a state of survival logic. Charlie is no longer just a journalist. He is a man haunted by a kinetic loss he cannot fix. Larissa has become a protective barrier, her focus entirely on her younger children. The house in New Mexico acts as a new tactical geometry, a place where they have tried to build a new life on the foundation of an old tragedy. The return of Katie is the catalyst that forces a recalibration of their entire system. She is no longer the biological daughter they remember. She is a catatonic asset with skin that has become a ledger for ancient scripture. The family's refusal to seek medical help for her erratic behavior is a key logic point. They are blinded by their emotional connection to her, ignoring the forensic evidence that she is a vessel for something else. This internal conflict is what allows the Nazmaranian demon to gain a foothold in their home. The way the demon uses Katie's body to manipulate the other children shows a sophisticated level of behavioral programming. The internal logic of the demon is defined by the ritual of mummification. The inscriptions on Katie's skin are not just decorations, they are the hardware that keeps the entity at bay. As she sheds these bindings and the scripture is removed, the demon's kinetic power increases. This is a brilliant reversal of traditional mummy logic. Instead of the bandages being the source of the monster's power, they are the constraint. This architectural choice by Lee Cronin creates a ticking clock for the family. Every time Katie self-harms or escapes her room, she is systematically removing her own containment system. This leads directly to the biological fallout of the third act, where the demon becomes powerful enough to take a new host. Charlie's final evolution involves a total sacrifice of his biological state. He realizes that the only way to save his daughter is to provide the demon with a more viable host. By accepting the demonic transfer from Dahlia, he saves Katie, but enters a state of permanent imprisonment. The final scene in the Cairo cell, where Larissa and Dahlia sedate the possessed Charlie, is a dark mirror of the film's beginning. The family is once again divided, but this time they are the ones who hold the power of containment. This ending provides a somber verdict on the cost of survival. The Cannon family has survived the Nazmaranian event, but their internal blueprint is permanently altered by the sacrifice. The initial diagnostic of the film's narrative infrastructure begins with a clear biological fallout indicator. In the city of Aswan, Egypt, the system state is introduced through a high-contrast thermal load. Specifically, a dead yellow canary positioned within a domestic cage. This is the primary forensic marker of a localized environmental breach. The specular glint on the bird's plumage suggests a recent cessation of life, a result of the encroaching supernatural pressure. This specific biological asset serves as the canary in the coal mine, a metric for the lethal force that has occupied the family home. The parents, categorized as secondary biological assets, return to find this terminal error in their household ecosystem. Moving from the exterior heat to the pressurized logic of the cellar, the architecture of the house reveals a deeper pipeline to the past. The basement is not a simple storage facility, but a tactical geometry built upon a buried black pyramid. The physics of this location are defined by a heavy volumetric haze and a low Kelvin scale lighting, creating a high degree of optical distortion. As the parents navigate this subterranean infrastructure, they encounter the basalt sarcophagus, a piece of ancient hardware designed for containment. The kinetic vector of the scene shifts as the father approaches the lid, triggering a catastrophic failure of the natural laws. The resulting displacement of the father by an unseen force is the first major forensic event of the film, establishing the lethal logic of the entity inside the stone housing. This prelude acts as the blueprint for the demonic infection that will eventually migrate from North Africa to the American Southwest. The internal programming of the story has been set, moving from a localized tragedy to a global biological threat. The subterranean infrastructure uncovered in the Aswan Prologue requires a detailed forensic deconstruction. This buried pyramid is the primary hardware for the Nasmaranian containment system. The architecture of the chamber is designed to concentrate gravitational constraints on the basalt sarcophagus, ensuring the biological host remains isolated from the surface population. The material science of the sarcophagus itself is significant. Basalt is a dense volcanic rock, selected for its ability to withstand the thermal load of the demon inside. When the father asset breaches the lid, he initiates a terminal error in the pyramid's containment logic. The forensic evidence suggests that the entity utilizes a kinetic vector to physically dismantle any biological threat that interrupts its stasis. The visual assets in this sequence utilize an anamorphic lens axis to emphasize the oppressive nature of the stone geometry. There is a specific chromatic saturation on the walls of the cellar, indicating that the pyramid has been bleeding energy into the house for decades. This environmental diagnostic explains the wounded bird and the overall decay of the family's domestic pipeline. The father's death is a clinical execution, a propulsive force that clears the way for the entity's extraction. This event marks the transition from a state of dormancy to an active incursion. The pyramid remains a silent metric of the power that has been unleashed, its blueprint serving as the origin point for the film's entire narrative logic. As the entity begins to stir, the film's focal length shifts to the city of Cairo, where the next phase of the infection will calibrate its target. The forensic study of the pyramid establishes that this is not a tomb of rest, but a hardware system designed for an eternal, high-pressure quarantine. The story shifts its focus to the Cairo urban infrastructure, specifically the communication pipeline managed by Charlie Cannon. Charlie, a journalist asset, is shown within the tactical geometry of a television newsroom. His news report on the Nile Delta serves as a logical metric for his character's role in the world. He is a man who audits reality and provides data to the public. The Kelvin scale of the newsroom is bright and clinical, providing a sharp contrast to the low-light distortion of the Aswan cellar. Charlie's life is defined by a stable domestic blueprint, consisting of his pregnant wife, Larissa, and their two biological assets, Katie and Sebastian. The internal programming of this chapter focuses on the stability of the family unit before the arrival of the sandstorm. The newsroom serves as a site of information gathering, where the infrastructure of modern society is still intact. However, the arrival of the woman known as the magician introduces a new behavioral stimulus into the environment. She represents an external kinetic vector, a force that will soon disrupt the Cannon family's domestic pipeline. The relationship between Katie and her friend Layla is established as a critical node in the narrative hardware. This bond is the vulnerability that the magician will exploit to initiate the abduction. The newsroom environment, with its screens and high-velocity data, is unable to detect the ancient logic that is about to breach its perimeter. As Charlie prepares his next report, the environmental sensors in the city begin to register a massive increase in atmospheric particulate matter. The sandstorm is not a natural weather event, but a volumetric haze generated by the entity to facilitate its primary mission. The focus on Charlie's professional life highlights the cognitive load he will carry when his career in reporting is replaced by a desperate need for forensic answers regarding his missing daughter. The sandstorm sequence is a high-pressure kinetic event that results in the total displacement of the Katie Cannon asset. The atmospheric architecture of Cairo is transformed into a dense volumetric haze, reducing visibility to a near-zero metric. This environmental condition creates a high cognitive load for Charlie as he attempts to track the magician who has lured his daughter away. The sandstorm serves as a tactical shroud, a piece of meteorological hardware used by the cult to facilitate the ritual extraction of the child. From a forensic perspective, the abduction is a perfectly executed maneuver that leaves no biological evidence behind, only the trauma of the missing asset. The physics of the chase are defined by friction and gravitational constraints. Charlie's movement through the city is hindered by the propulsive force of the wind, and the optical distortion caused by the sand. The magician utilizes a candy-based behavioral stimulus to manipulate Katie's internal programming, leading her away from her family's protective perimeter. This sequence highlights the vulnerability of the domestic unit when faced with a supernatural kinetic vector. The sandstorm effectively severs the communication pipeline between the family and the local authorities, allowing the cult to vanish into the desert. When the storm clears, the diagnostic of the city reveals a terminal error in the Cannon family structure. The kidnapping is the pivot point of the film's narrative logic, shifting the story from a state of normalcy to an 8-year-long investigation. The forensic aftermath shows a father who is no longer reporting the news, but has become the subject of a tragic audit. The inability of the detective assets to locate the child in the Aswan Pyramid region demonstrates the effectiveness of the cult's tactical geometry. Katie has been removed from the visible spectrum, her biological state now governed by the ancient hardware of the Nazmaranian ritual. The transition across an 8-year time jump represents a significant recalibration of the film's narrative blueprint. The environment shifts from the thermal load of Cairo to the high desert geometry of Albuquerque, New Mexico. This change in location is visualized through a series of wide focal length shots, highlighting the isolation of the new Cannon household. The family has relocated to the home of Larissa's mother, Carmen, a tactical move intended to provide a stable infrastructure for their recovery. However, the forensic diagnostic of the family shows a system state in decline. Charlie remains trapped in a loop of investigative logic, unable to process the permanent displacement of his eldest daughter. The optical distortion of the film's Kelvin scale reflects this shift. The warm, saturated tones of Egypt are replaced by the cooler, more muted chromatic saturation of the American Southwest. This change in the film's thermal profile mirrors the emotional cooling of the family unit. The biological assets have grown, with Sebastian, now a teenager, and a new child, Maudie, added to the family pipeline. Despite these additions, the absence of Katie remains a massive cognitive load on the entire system. The news of a cargo plane crash in the desert acts as the trigger for a new forensic event. The plane was carrying the sarcophagus, and its destruction in a high-velocity impact results in the discovery of a mummified biological asset in a catatonic state. This asset is identified as Katie, though her internal programming and physical hardware have been completely altered by her time in the cult's containment. The discovery of the sarcophagus in a forest clearing creates a new kinetic vector for the story, drawing the Cannon family back into the influence of the Nazmaranian entity. The 8 years of silence are over, replaced by the rhythmic friction of a child who has been transformed into a supernatural vessel. The forensic audit of the cargo plane crash site reveals a high thermal load and massive structural failure. The physics of the event involve a high-velocity ballistic trajectory that ended in the total destruction of the aircraft's fuselage. Among the debris, the basalt sarcophagus from Aswan remains largely intact, a testament to its ancient material science and engineering. Inside this stone hardware, the archaeological assets find the Katie Cannon biological asset. She is wrapped in parchment and inscribed with an ancient linguistic code, her physical state reflecting 8 years of ritualistic mummification. This is not a standard recovery operation. It is a diagnostic of a body that has been transformed into a tactical asset for a demon. The crash site is a scene of intense volumetric haze and specular glints from the scattered wreckage. The kinetic energy of the impact was enough to breach the sarcophagus, allowing the entity inside to begin its influence on the surrounding environment. The recovery of Katie initiates a new logistical pipeline for the Cannon family. They are reunited with a daughter who no longer functions as a human asset. Her behavioral stimulus is non-responsive, and her biological state is one of constant self-harm and catatonia. The forensic deconstruction of the crash suggests that the event was not an accident but a calculated displacement of the sarcophagus to a new tactical coordinate. The presence of the demon in the Albuquerque region represents a massive escalation of the biological fallout. The sarcophagus acts as the primary node of infection, its movement from Egypt to the United States, completing the migration of the Nazmaranian blueprint. As the family brings Katie home, they are unknowingly importing a terminal error into their domestic sanctuary. The house in Albuquerque is now the new tactical geometry, where the final phase of the ritual will be calibrated. The thermal load of the crash site is just the beginning of a much larger, more destructive energy release that will soon consume the Cannon family. The return of Katie Cannon to the domestic environment provides a fascinating study in behavioral stimulus and system state failure. Katie, now a mummified biological asset, does not communicate through standard linguistic channels. Instead, she exists in a state of catatonic suspension, her physical hardware responding only to the internal programming of the Nazmaranian entity. The family's house in Albuquerque becomes a clinical observation deck where they attempt to diagnose the changes in their daughter. Her habit of self-mutilation is a forensic indicator that her physical body is under a high degree of internal pressure, a kinetic friction between her human biology and the demonic force. The domestic geometry of the home is recalibrated to accommodate her needs, but this only increases the cognitive load on the other family members. The presence of a mute, non-responsive child who periodically attempts to escape her room creates a massive disruption in the household pipeline. Larissa and Charlie are blinded by their emotional attachment, refusing to acknowledge the forensic evidence that Katie has been replaced by a supernatural entity. The way she stares at her sibling, Sebastian and Maudie, is a behavioral stimulus that suggests she is auditing them as potential new hosts. The use of a cool Kelvin scale in these interior scenes emphasizes the lack of human warmth in Katie's new system state. Her silence is a powerful tactical tool, forcing the parents to fill the void with their own desperate hopes and logical fallacies. This chapter focuses on the slow erosion of the family's structural integrity as they try to reintegrate a daughter who is fundamentally broken. The internal logic of the house is now governed by Katie's erratic behavior, moving from a place of safety to a site of localized biological fallout. The forensic audit of this period shows a family that is waiting for a recovery that is physically impossible according to the laws of the demonic ritual. To understand the biological fallout occurring in the Cannon home, the audit shifts to an investigation of the Nazmaranian blueprint. Charlie consults an archaeology professor, Asset, who performs a forensic deconstruction of the inscriptions found on Katie's skin. This ancient linguistic hardware reveals that Nazmaranian is not just a myth, but a sophisticated demonic system designed to destroy families and community infrastructures. The demon's primary method of operation involves the infection of a host and the subsequent manipulation of the surrounding biological assets. The mummification process, involving the embedding of scripture into the skin, is the only known containment logic that can hold the entity in stasis. The professor explains that as the scripture is removed or the skin is damaged, the demon's kinetic vector becomes more powerful. This provides a clear diagnostic for Katie's self-harming behavior. She is systematically dismantling her own containment hardware to allow the entity to reach its full potential. The blueprint of the demon is one of total consumption, a propulsive force that seeks to expand its influence through the destruction of the domestic unit. The archaeological data highlights that the ritual performed by the cult in Egypt was a way to transfer the demon into a live host as a form of eternal burial. Katie is the current vessel, a piece of biological hardware that is reaching its end-of-life cycle. The forensic evidence suggests that the demon will soon require a new host, creating a high-pressure situation for the Cannon family. This information increases the cognitive load on Charlie, who must now accept that his daughter is a tactical weapon aimed at his family. The archaeological research serves as the primary informational pipeline, providing the audience and the characters with the rules of the supernatural system state. The Nazmaranian entity is a clinical predator, and its blueprint is a map for the total annihilation of the biological assets it inhabits. The Albuquerque house is the primary tactical geometry for the second act. Its architecture is analyzed as a series of connected nodes, including the kitchen, the bedrooms, and the basement, each serving a specific role in the progression of the biological fallout. The dining room is the central coordinate where the family attempts to maintain a standard domestic pipeline. However, the presence of the catatonic Katie asset at the table creates a massive cognitive load. The internal logic of the family dinner is shattered by the lack of response from the primary host. The seating arrangement is a diagnostic of the family's current state, a collection of biological assets orbiting a void. The kitchen geometry is where the physical friction between the family members begins to escalate. As Katie's demonic influence grows, the house itself begins to reflect the environmental decay seen in the Aswan Prologue. The plumbing and electrical hardware show signs of terminal error, a result of the localized gravitational constraints exerted by the Nazmaranian entity. The basement, like the pyramid cellar, is the ultimate containment node, a place where the family will eventually have to confront the physical reality of the demon. The use of a lens axis that emphasizes tight, enclosed spaces reflects the increasing pressure on the characters. They are trapped within a tactical geometry that is being systematically closed off by the entity. The way the characters move through the house shows a high degree of behavioral stimulus, with each member responding to the unseen kinetic vectors of the demon. Carmen's presence in the house provides a religious metric, but her Catholic belief system is an outdated piece of software that cannot stop the modern biological failure occurring around her. The Albuquerque house is no longer a sanctuary. It is a forensic lab where the final stages of the demonic infection are being tested. The final diagnostic in this segment focuses on the cognitive load of deciphering the skin scripture. The inscriptions on Katie's body are a complex piece of ancient hardware. These are not tattoos but ritualistic scarring that acts as a containment field for the Nazmaranian entity. Charlie's audit of these markings, with the help of archaeological data, provides the key to the demon's containment logic. The scripture is written in an ancient linguistic code that acts as a set of rules for the biological host. As long as the skin remains intact and the scripture is visible, the demon's kinetic vector is suppressed. However, the forensic evidence shows that the entity is forcing Katie to mutilate herself to bypass these gravitational constraints. The skin is being stripped away in a systematic fashion, a process of biological shedding that allows the demon to interact with the environment. This creates an enormous cognitive load for Charlie and Larissa, who must watch their daughter physically dismantle her own body. The realization that the skin itself is the primary containment hardware changes their tactical approach to the situation. They must now attempt to rebandage her, not for healing, but to restore the containment logic of the scripture. The friction of the bandages against the wounded skin is a physical manifestation of the struggle between the human assets and the supernatural entity. The linguistic code on her flesh is the only thing standing between the family and a total system state collapse. This clinical focus on the material science of the ritual shows that the supernatural force is bound by physical metrics and linguistic laws. The decoding of the scripture provides the necessary data for the third act confrontation, establishing the rules of the demonic transfer. The lighting infrastructure of the Albuquerque household utilizes a specific Kelvin scale to define its tactical geometry. Cinematographer Dave Garbett employs a high contrast ratio that emphasizes the volumetric haze present in the hallways. This optical choice serves to create a state of chromatic saturation, where the shadows act as a physical weight on the biological assets. Moving from the warm thermal load of the kitchen to the cold, blue-tinted logic of the second floor, the film's thermal profile shifts to indicate an encroaching supernatural presence. The anamorphic lens axis provides a wide focal length that captures the isolation of the characters within their own domestic hardware. This specific hardware calibration results in a shallow depth of field, forcing the audience to focus on the biological fallout visible on the characters' faces. The use of a specular glint in the darkness indicates the presence of the basalt entity, even when it is not fully visible on the screen. This is not a stylistic choice, but a technical metric used to track the entity's kinetic vector through the house. The lighting does not merely illuminate. It acts as a diagnostic tool for the audience to measure the level of infection in the environment. Low-level Kelvin sources are placed strategically to mimic the ancient lighting conditions of the Aswan Pyramid, creating a bridge between the two primary tactical geometries. This calibration ensures that the transition between the modern and the ancient is logically sound. The optical distortion at the edges of the anamorphic lens reflects the mental degradation of the characters, as their internal programming begins to fail under the pressure of the Nazmaranian presence. Every light source is a metric of survival, with the flickering hardware indicating a terminal error in the home safety protocols. The discovery of the VHS tape by Detective Zaki serves as a critical piece of archaeological hardware within the film's narrative pipeline. This tape provides a clinical record of the ritualistic logic used to transfer the Nazmaranian entity into a biological host. The forensic deconstruction of the footage reveals the magician as the architect of this system state, demonstrating how she manipulated the biological asset of Katie to serve as a vessel. The video quality is defined by a high degree of optical distortion and chromatic noise, which acts as a behavioral stimulus for the audience, signaling the corruption of the recorded event. As Charlie and Larissa audit the tape, their cognitive load increases as they realize the full scope of the terminal error that has occurred in their family. The ritual footage provides a blueprint for the demonic transfer chant, a linguistic hardware that is mandatory for the third act resolution. The forensic evidence on the tape shows the physical friction between the host's skin and the ritualistic bindings, a diagnostic of the pain required to sustain the demon. The synaptic response of the girl in the video mirrors the current state of Katie in the Albuquerque house, proving that the infection follows a predictable internal programming. This audit bridges the informational gap between the characters and the ancient cult, providing the necessary data for the final confrontation. The use of a VHS format is a specific logical choice, as it represents an analog hardware that is difficult to erase or alter, mirroring the permanence of the demonic possession. The tape acts as the central informational node of the film, connecting the Aswan prologue to the Albuquerque climax. The attack on Carmen Santiago represents a total failure of the domestic security protocol. This sequence is a study in kinetic vectors and biological fallout. Katie, acting as the primary biological asset for the demon, utilizes a high-velocity propulsive force to physically dismantle the presence of her grandmother. The synaptic response of the other children, Sebastian and Maudie, is one of total cognitive paralysis as they watch the entity take control of the environment. The tactical geometry of the bedroom is transformed into a site of ballistic trauma, where the natural laws of inertia are suspended by the entity's presence. The forensic diagnostic of the scene shows that Carmen's Catholic hardware is insufficient to stop the ancient logic of the Nazmaranian demon. Her death is a clinical execution, intended to remove the primary barrier of faith within the household. The displacement of her body by the possessed Katie is a metric of the demon's growing kinetic power. Every movement in this sequence is defined by a high degree of friction and gravitational constraint, as the entity asserts its dominance over the physical plane. The biological fallout of the attack is visible in the desecration of Carmen's corpse, a terminal error that signals the end of the family's hope for a peaceful resolution. This event acts as a powerful behavioral stimulus for Charlie and Larissa, forcing them into a state of total emergency logic. One of the most significant physical deviations in the film occurs during the bedroom levitation sequence. This event is a clinical study in the manipulation of gravitational constraints by the Nazmaranian entity. The biological assets are lifted from the ground, their bodies subject to a kinetic vector that defies standard physics. This is not a magical event, but a diagnostic of the entity's ability to alter the local gravitational field within the tactical geometry of the room. The inertia of the objects in the room is neutralized, creating a state of volumetric haze where everything is suspended in a pressurized void. The optical field of this sequence utilizes a specific lens axis to emphasize the lack of a ground plane. The chromatic saturation is lowered, shifting the environment toward a more clinical, forensic profile. The behavioral stimulus of the levitation causes a total collapse of the character's logical defense mechanisms. They are no longer fighting a physical opponent, but a force that can manipulate the very fabric of their reality. The forensic deconstruction of the scene suggests that the levitation is a precursor to the final demonic transfer, a way for the entity to demonstrate its total control over the biological hardware of its hosts. The friction of the air against the suspended bodies is a metric of the power being exerted. As the characters hang in the air, their cognitive load reaches a breaking point, leading to a state of total surrender to the entity's will. Detective Dalia Zaki's arrival in New Mexico marks the intersection of the film's two primary narrative pipelines. Her field report from Cairo provided the forensic foundation for the investigation, but her physical presence in Albuquerque is the catalyst for the final resolution. Dalia acts as a high-competence biological asset, her internal programming focused on the clinical audit of the Nazmaranian threat. She carries with her the linguistic hardware necessary to perform the transfer ritual, a blueprint she discovered in the ruins of the Aswan Pyramid. Her movement across the globe is a kinetic vector that brings the ancient Egyptian logic into direct contact with the American domestic failure. The diagnostic of Dalia's character reveals a professional who is governed by data and logic, making her the perfect counterbalance to the emotional collapse of the Cannon family. She performs a forensic deconstruction of the Albuquerque house, identifying the nodes of infection and the tactical geometry required for the final confrontation. Her interaction with the possessed Katie is defined by a high degree of caution and the use of protective hardware. Dalia bridges the gap between the archaeological past and the biological present, her role being to calibrate the final sacrifice. The cognitive load she carries is immense, as she is the only person who understands the true nature of the terminal error they are facing. The demonic transfer ritual is the ultimate friction point of the film's narrative infrastructure. This event is a clinical execution of the Nazmaranian blueprint, involving the voluntary sacrifice of one biological asset to save another. Charlie Cannon, acting as the primary donor, accepts the kinetic vector of the demon, allowing it to migrate from Katie's body into his own. The forensic diagnostic of the transfer shows a massive synaptic response in both hosts as the entity travels through the biological pipeline between them. This is a high-pressure event, defined by a massive energy release and a total breakdown of the local tactical geometry. The physics of the transfer involve a high degree of friction as the demonic force breaches the cellular barriers of the new host. The chromatic saturation of the scene shifts to a deep, bruised purple, indicating the lethal nature of the biological fallout. Dalia Zaki performs the ritual chant, the linguistic hardware that facilitates the displacement of the entity. The internal programming of the demon is recalibrated to accept Charlie as its new containment hardware. This is a terminal error for Charlie's human identity, as his biological state is permanently overwritten by the ancient logic of the basalt sarcophagus. The forensic evidence of the transfer is visible in the physical transformation of Charlie's skin, as the mummified scripture begins to manifest on his flesh. The conclusion of Charlie Cannon's narrative arc is defined by a single, rhythmic kinetic vector. Locked inside the containment hardware of a coffin in the basement, the now-possessed Charlie uses the only communication pipeline remaining to him, Morse code. This rhythmic friction against the wood is a transmission of emotional data, a final packet of information sent to his family. The code translates to "I love you," a diagnostic of the remaining human consciousness fighting against the demonic internal programming. This is the ultimate terminal error of the film, a state where the biological asset is physically lost, but the cognitive signal remains. The forensic audit of this moment shows the high cognitive load on Katie and Larissa as they receive this transmission. They are safe from the demonic infection, but their domestic blueprint is permanently altered by the sacrifice. The basement, once a storage facility, is now the primary containment node for the Nazmaranian entity. The use of a low Kelvin scale and a tight focal length emphasizes the isolation of Charlie's new system state. The rhythmic tapping is a metric of his suffering, a constant reminder of the physical and mental friction he must endure to keep the demon at bay. The technical infrastructure of Lee Cronin's The Mummy is defined by the use of the Sony Venice 2 hardware pipeline. This specific sensor provides an 8.6K capture, allowing for a massive amount of data to be recorded in every optical field. The calibration of this hardware was handled by Dave Garbett, who sought to create a cinematic blueprint that prioritized texture and chromatic saturation. By utilizing the full-frame sensor, the production team was able to capture the volumetric haze and specular glints of the Egyptian and New Mexican environments with clinical precision. The high dynamic range of the Venice 2 sensor allowed for a detailed audit of the shadows, ensuring that the basalt entity remained visible even in low-light tactical geometries. The optics used for this project include the Panavision L-series anamorphic lenses. These lenses are known for their specific optical distortion and a lens axis that provides a unique sense of depth. In the Albuquerque house, the anamorphic lenses were used to emphasize the horizontal displacement of the characters, making them feel small within their own architecture. The forensic deconstruction of the film's technical specs reveals a commitment to practical friction and physical reality. The final diagnostic provides a somber verdict on the cost of the demonic incursion. The epilogue, set in a Cairo cell, reveals that the biological fallout of the Nazmaranian event is ongoing. Charlie, now the primary host for the entity, is incarcerated and sedated, his body acting as a living basalt hardware. Larissa and Zaki have returned to Egypt to perform the final ritual logic, which involves the sacrifice of the magician to free Charlie from the possession. This closing sequence represents a total shift in the film's tactical geometry, moving from the domestic failure of Albuquerque back to the ancient infrastructure of Cairo. The forensic deconstruction of the ending suggests that the Cannon family has entered a permanent state of maintenance. They are no longer living, they are managing a terminal error. The relationship between Larissa and Dahlia has evolved into a clinical partnership, focused on the containment and eventual elimination of the demon. The possessed Charlie is a shell, a piece of biological hardware that has been completely subverted by the demonic internal programming. The final audit reveals a cinematic infrastructure that is built on the principles of forensic horror. This is not a film about adventure or legends. It is a clinical study of biological fallout and domestic failure. The narrative blueprint, starting with the Aswan Prologue and ending in the Cairo cell, is a perfectly calibrated system state that explores the physics of demonic possession. Every element of the film, from the basalt sarcophagus hardware to the mummified skin scripture, is treated as a physical reality governed by the laws of friction and kinetic energy. The characters are not just people, they are biological assets navigating a lethal tactical geometry. The directorial logic of Lee Cronin is defined by a focus on the anatomy of the monster. He has successfully reimagined the mummy as a modern biological threat, stripping away the fantasy elements to reveal a core of ancient, pressurized terror. The $89 million fiscal metric proves that there is a significant audience for this type of clinical, data-heavy horror. As we conclude this field report, the cinematic infrastructure of The Mummy stands as a testament to the power of grounded, logical storytelling. The biological fallout of the Cannon family is a warning about the ancient hardware that still exists beneath the surface of our world. The audit is complete. The system is stable. The sacrifice has been recorded.